Hi, welcome everyone to my channel. This is Common Sense Ethics. My guest today is Max Maxwell. Hi, Max.
Hello, thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming on again. Very exciting to have you back. And do you want to say, you want to plug your website and anything quickly you'd like us to know about your site or social media or anything like that?
Oh, my co-author and I publish our stuff at socraticmethod.net. Right now we're working on a book called Fundamentals of Education. It's about half done. We've been working on it since 2012. Half of it's up there now, and we're hoping to have that done by the end of the year.
Very good.
And yeah.
Yeah, and just to give the listeners a little bit of background about, the series of videos that this will be a part of, Max and I share a dislike for politics being discussed in, solely partisan terms. So, I wanted to start a Socratic dialogue on government, and I anticipate there being a lot of installments of these videos. But when I was younger, and I think a lot of people sort of think this, maybe suffer from this same line of thinking, that we think, if we could just change government, right, things would be better. That the problem must lie with the system of government that we have, or with government generally. But then, as I got older and I thought about it more, it seemed that basically the problem isn't necessarily government. The central problem is, or can be, people. And, just
That's a more organic approach.
Well, yeah, or just sort of the reason, well, let me put it this way. The reason that government sort of all over the world can suffer from corruption, some types of government seem to be become corrupt faster than others. But the reason that happens is because there can be a fundamental ethical problem with us, or some of us anyway, or with sort of the corruption of power and various other things. At least that's what I think now, which is why I sort of launched this series of videos to sort of examine different types of, governments, and discussing, each type as a political philosophy. I'm going to have people come on to talk about Marxism. I'll have people come on to talk about, libertarianism and various other philosophies of government. Many types, really, of like sort of the history of liberalism and of the Enlightenment and so forth. But today we're going to touch a little bit on, we're just going to sort of let it rip in Socratic style and see where this goes. But what we'd like to talk about is sort of the fundamentals of, the purpose of the state. What is the purpose of the state, if we can get that far. Is that right, Max?
Pretty much. I don't know if we'll get that far, but because we're going to start with purpose generally. But
sure, that's fine. Yes.
I have some introductory comments if you
go
want
ahead.
to start. Okay, and I also hope a little bit today it serves, the dialogue serves as an illustration of the truth of George Steiner's comment about Plato, which was that if we lost everything, our whole civilization, but still had Plato, we could rebuild civilization. And I believe, to the extent that that's true, it's based on the fact that we have common sense. My favorite quote about the Socratic method is by Gregory Vlastos, a 20th century scholar. He wrote, "Why rank that method among the great achievements of humanity? Because it makes moral inquiry a common human enterprise, and that's open to everyone. Its practice calls for no adherence to a philosophical system, no mastery of specialized technique, no acquisition of a technical vocabulary. And it calls for common sense and common speech, and this is how it should be, because how human beings should live is everybody's business." And so the idea of taking back political talk and making it everybody's business is sort of the home court of the Socratic method. The good news is we don't have to know all the facts in the world in order to have substantive and useful perspectives on politics, on right and wrong, and social issues of the day. Even if everybody we see on the news as a liar, because in a useful discussion in the Socratic style, we only need to produce one honest witness, and that witness is you. And we only have to be our own honest witness. So you are the only witness to the internal process of your own living and thinking. You are the only witness to your own ideas about how we ought to live. You're the only witness that you'll ever need in order to take an independent stand from the rampage of useless lying that is the fashion of fake politics in the U.S. And so, it may be very difficult to think about the complexities of an entire world system, of an entire government, but anyone can think about their own living And if we can do that, just think about our own living. That gives us access to a broader scope of things that have political and social implications in a way that has basic substance and depth. And so when I'm a sole witness to my own living, there's no need to mention Democrats or Republicans. There's no need to talk about conservatives or liberals. There's no need to talk about left or right. It all depends on my own ability to take an honest look at myself. And Socrates' ideal of the examined life is to live a life in which we are neither afraid nor negligent, to open our eyes and take a hard look at ourselves. Yeah. And I don't know the whole world, but I do know myself. And that's the beginning. Self-knowledge, in which we express our own thinking and our own living, is a major part of the foundation of operations in the Socratic style of talk. And it basically has to do, one of the key centers of it is a respect for language. I'm not a Plato scholar. I disregard much of Plato's legacy, but I learned a few basic things that I lived. And one of those things is that if I use a word in a sentence, I have to know what it means. And Sure. if I'm talking with you, we have to be on the same page of what that word means, or we're not really communicating. And also, I learned that I'm profoundly and deeply ignorant about what's most important in life. And so by nature of my natural ignorance, I'm obligated to myself to be forced to have to exercise my capacity to reason about the words I use, about the ideas I embrace, about how I choose to live. And so starting there is where it's all at. So I learned from Plato that to start out, we just make sure that we give some thought to the words we use. So when we talk about purpose of government, excuse me. When we talk about purpose of government, this is going to be a very different way of talking about politics, because now you are going to be the sole witness to the truth of everything. We'll rely on you for all of that. Don't worry, you don't have to know everything. You'll just have to know yourself. But before addressing the phrase "purpose of government," I want to ask about purpose, because this is sort of like in the dialogues of Plato, where Socrates was the kind of guy who'd be like, well, I don't know if it was a pious action for you to imprison your father. I don't know what piety is. What is piety? I don't know if this law is just or unjust. What is justice? And so before we talk about purpose of government, let's sort of think about the word purpose and generally. Now, I'm going to ask you what is purpose, but I'm not asking about the meaning of life or purpose in the grand scope of all humanity. Those are things that might require knowledge we don't have access to.
Sure.
I'm just going to talk about simple, small things in ordinary life, things like, if I purpose myself to make a cup of tea or alphabetize my books or finish a project with a team, the creation and fulfillment of purpose in ordinary daily life is the focus. So when I ask you what is purpose, it's not as if we're going to find out some abstract, mystical, platonic form of purpose. This is more personal. What is purpose for you in your daily living? Define purpose out of your experience of being a creator and fulfiller of purposes.
Oh, so you're asking me that?
Yes.
Purpose, I guess, is your reason for doing something.
Okay. So when we talk about any purposes, whether it's purpose of an individual or the purpose of government, is it safe to say that we need to have clearly defined reasons at the start?
Yeah. Okay.
And what if we're working together with people? Do you ever work with, you have a common purpose with a team of people or with your family, and you're all working together, that same purpose? Does that add anything to what's required to fulfill purpose? That's what I want to move on to. So you've stated purpose, but what does it take to be successful at fulfilling a purpose?
I guess
so when you
having a shared purpose plus putting effort in.
Okay, could we say that a vision of a common good or a common benefit that you're getting from the purpose? Okay.
Yeah.
And would you also say that knowledge or at least accuracy of information would be necessary to fulfill a purpose?
Yeah, some.
Yeah. And how about reliability of word and deed? When you're working with a group of people, do you need people to say what they mean and do what they say in order to get it done?
It certainly makes it easier.
Yeah. And to some extent, is it safe to say that it can be impossible to get it done if it requires the whole group, but they're just not reliable? It's not going to happen.
Yeah.
I mean, that can sometimes be true too, right?
Yeah.
And what about respectful cooperation? When you work with people, do you find that helps fulfilling purposes?
Yeah.
And could we say that if you had 100% lack of cooperation, that could actually stop us from fulfilling a purpose?
Yeah, certainly.
Okay, so now you've experienced these things in your personal life. Would you say that these things that we just listed, clearly defined reasons, vision of a common good, accuracy of information, reliability of word and deed, respectful communication, the exercise of reason, not even, oh, I didn't get to exercise of reason yet, not even a comprehensive list by any stretch of the imagination. We could have very different lists even maybe, but that these would also apply to government. Like,
Yeah.
Whether it's a small group in your personal life or a government, if a government acts to fulfill purposes, do they need these characteristics to be successful in fulfilling their purpose? We're not defining purpose of government yet, but whatever the purpose of government is, do they need these characteristics?
Yeah.
Okay. And I'm sorry. Let's see here. So now, to me, this is one of the things that I find exciting about the Socratic method. I'm sorry if I was rushing. I felt like we were kind of blasting through questions and not necessarily giving you an opportunity to illustrate anything. But
if I had more to say, I would have said it.
Okay. And I start going faster and faster on this video. I don't know why, but it's interesting that the things that we reason about in ordinary simple things actually are the same patterns and principles that apply to larger things. So some of the things that you know for sure because you've lived a life and you've created purposes and you've filled purposes, you see it now. It can apply to government too. We're not even defining purpose yet. But so when you talked about the Constitution, we have the list that you created. One of in the preamble of the Constitution is a statement of purposes, and one of those mandates is to establish justice. And so, for example, your list that you created, I'm curious what you think about its relationship to justice. Do you think that we could possibly have a society in which justice is flourishing if there's a complete absence of clearly defined reasons for how people do things? It would be sort of chaotic, I would imagine. Might be not helpful to justice at that point. Would you agree with that? Or do you think that clearly defined reasons in our purposes are not necessary for justice to be healthy in a society?
I'm not really sure. What do you think?
Well, can you think of an example in which that would not be the case? That
maybe you could rephrase the question, if that's all right.
Okay. I'll skip on to some other things, and I'll come back to it. Sure. The vision of a common good, do you find that necessary to defining justice? If there's no vision of a common good,
yeah, absolutely. Because then people will be arguing about the fundamentals, rather than...
And if people had no knowledge and no accuracy of information, would the establishment of justice suffer from that? When you go to fulfill the purposes of whatever your society is, your government is, the people, even if you have a common vision of a common good, if it's not accurate, that would hurt it. And as you can see what we're doing, we're kind of going down the list. And the things that you pointed out for reliability of purpose is like, reliability of word and deed. If you had a whole society of people who never said what they meant and never did what they said, how could justice be well? Wouldn't we have a real problem maintaining the establishment of justice?
That makes sense.
Or if you had nothing but disrespectful non-cooperation, where does justice go then? And at this point, it's interesting because we can start off just talking about what I know from making a cup of tea or working with a group of people, and suddenly it has implications for a whole society and a whole government, and it helps us interpret the Constitution. So, for example, in the freedom of speech, that's granted as a right in the First Amendment. Now, when you think of freedom of speech, what does that mean to you?
Probably the right to not be imprisoned for speaking as truthfully as you can.
Mm-hmm. Is it just a freedom, or does it imply responsibilities for you?
It implies responsibilities, because
Okay.
I mean, because you know, you want to try to speak as honestly as possible, you know, not be duplicitous, and not scream fire in a crowded theater unless there really is a fire.
Right. Now, when you in your personal life, so let's try to keep it close to that. Just think about how you talk with people in your personal life. When you have the freedom to speak with your family, with coworkers, what are some of the things that make that freedom valuable? What are some of the qualities of your speech that this is a good thing that I have freedom of speech, not a bad thing? What can you describe? Can you think about that?
Maybe better.
I'm sorry.
Go on.
I'm sorry. Was that not clear? Sometimes I ask unclear questions.
It was more or less clear, but if you might be able to tell if I haven't understood by my response. But I don't know. I assume that it would make relationships more successful if you have the freedom to speak freely.
Mm-hmm.
Or yeah.
And
well,
do you think
I guess
that,
it depends how you speak too.
Yeah, and so I'm curious, we can speak freely, but if you speak poorly, does it help or hurt in a lot of situations?
Yeah, well, it definitely hurts.
Okay, so speaking freely in itself is not the benefit.
Yeah.
It's a necessary prerequisite, but also speaking well.
Yeah.
So like what we just did with freedom of speech, it's just a little bit of thought about, what does it take for speech to really mean something? Suddenly you can be thinking about your experiences in your personal life, and it creates ideas that we can apply to a whole society. What is the quality of the speaking that people are doing in public? When I think of the freedom of speech, it's all over the news. People have freedom of speech, but what are they doing with it? So when I think of my personal life, I'm wondering, well, it's not just freedom of speech. I have to take due diligence and make some effort to speak well, to make it useful, to make sure I'm doing my best. And so when it comes to how government communicates and government speaks, they have freedom of speech too in their roles. Yeah. Thinking about our personal life and what our standards would be for ourselves, we can apply that to government.
Yeah.
So we can do that in every aspect of our lives. Whatever aspect of living we would have a standard for, because we've grown up enough, lived long enough to be responsible to manage our day, gives us little insights in what it would be to manage anything, including a government. And of course, doing this is not like picking up a Happy Meal from McDonald's. I mean, if we actually lost civilization and just built it back thinking out of Plato, it would take centuries.
Yeah.
But could be done. And so regarding your list, you affirmed that for the fulfillment of purposes, we had these 5 things. And I'm assuming we could add the exercise of reason. Clearly defined reason sort of implies that we're using our capacity to reason in order to have that. Vision of a common good sounds like it would require reasoning to establish. Interpreting information that's accurate sounds like it. Sounds like all these things would require functioning reasoning in order to work. I'm sort of inclined to add that to the list. And would you agree with that? Or do you want to add the exercise of reason to the things that are required to successfully fulfill purposes? And so here's the thing. Are these things arbitrary? Can we just pick them up and put them down at will and still be successful? Or to the extent that we disregard them, we will hurt our chances?
Yeah, that's probably accurate.
Okay, so these things seem like they're necessary to me. Would you agree with that?
Yeah.
And so just thinking about ordinary reasoning about purposes in our daily lives, it gives us ideas about governance, in terms of criticism of what is to a functioning government. What is the status of reasoning in our government today? What is the status of respectful cooperation between the parties? What is the reliability of word and deed? Does our government say what it means and does what it says? Do they give us accurate information? Is there a vision of the common good? Does anyone talk about a common good ever? That includes all citizens? And do they have clearly defined reasons? It sounds like it'd be no for all of that. So when so here this is not defining the purpose of government per se, but in terms of their ability to fulfill whatever their purpose is.
Yeah. Well,
it seems like we don't even have to know that in order to realize there's a problem.
Yeah. Yeah,
So
absolutely. That's why I wanted to sort of start this dialogue, because of
yeah.
sort of the corruption of whatever the initial purpose was.
Now, do you have what would you say the purpose of government is?
Well, there's probably a lot of purposes, but I mean, if we go by what's in the Constitution, it's what to provide for the common defense, right? Whatever that means, that
Yeah,
would mean that to sort of work together, to prevent you know enemies from attacking us, or taking over the territory that we're living in.
yeah. There's a variety of things. Now, when you read the preamble, it says, "In order to form a more perfect union, establish justice, ensure
Yeah,
tranquility, provide for the
yeah.
common defense, promote the general welfare, and secure the blessings of liberty." Um, do you get the sense that there's an idea that maybe there's a more singular description that these things might serve? Are these things ends in themselves, or do they serve something else?
I guess they serve something else.
And can we say what that is?
That's difficult to say, but maybe to allow people to flourish.
That's an interesting proposal. The idea that I mean, it certainly seems. If I hired someone to take care of my horses and the guy killed them, I would say, okay, whatever your purpose was, that was not it. so, so somehow the people have to survive and thrive and flourish in some way. And when we think of having a common vision of a common good or a public good, do we have to get more specific about that? Like you said, in the fulfillment of purpose, whatever our government's purpose is, do we have to define a vision of a common good with some specificity in order to define the purpose of our government?
Yeah.
And and what would that be like? What kind of things do we need to uphold that are of benefit to all citizens in terms of that vision? I think that the Constitution has some of those ideas, some of the rights that are granted. Would you agree that granting of rights is somehow part of that?
Sure, yeah.
Yeah. Now, is the granting of rights an end in itself, or serving some kind of thriving that we have not yet defined? Is a question that keeps coming back to me.
Yeah, it's what we haven't defined.
Yeah, and so here's my question: what are we not defining? Because lots of talk goes on detailing the rights, or talking about how rights may be necessary for a public good. But what are we missing in terms of not defining? What does it mean for human beings to thrive well, such that government should manage that and promote it? What does that look like?
Probably freedom from. Go on.
No, that's okay. You
I
go
was
ahead.
gonna say probably freedom from interference. Like, I guess, is that negative freedom?
Just not being directly obstructed.
Correct.
And
Yeah.
so when people, sometimes people obstruct themselves, would we stop them from obstructing themselves? And that would be part of the purpose of government?
It depends
or
what you mean by that.
Yeah, it gets blurry, because on one hand, we need the freedom to make mistakes. On the other hand, if our mistakes are killing us, it seems to defeat the purpose. And if our killing us starts killing other people too, of course, it
Yeah.
gets stopped. But is there a kind of thriving where we can define it in social terms? That what is a healthy society compared to, in terms of citizen relationships and stuff like that? Do we have a way of measuring that, such that we can look at ourselves and tell where we stand, and define, maybe have some handle on defining government there?
It's probably hard to do, to make a holistic assessment, especially
Mhm.
because of the interference of media, and in shaping our perspectives on whether our society is healthy or not.
Yeah, so I mean, we definitely agree that purpose of government has to have something to do with promoting the thriving. Our Constitution has ideas about that, creating a structure of government that's least likely to interfere. We have the separation of powers. We have the granting of rights to people, the limiting of powers to the government. But in all of that, we haven't really said, what exactly do the blessings of liberty serve? What exactly is the general welfare such that we have an end in sight? It seems to be always described in terms of what it takes not to fall over and die. But can we define purpose of government in terms of that undefined dimension, where there's something about human thriving that has a positive description, but we're not really sure how to say that, and there's no agreement on it. There's certainly, every religion has a slightly different take on it. Now there are commonalities, but
yeah, that's very true.
And I'm kind of doing this weird pace thing where I'm jumping around, and because I'm in this feeling like I'm in a demo mode on a video.
I don't think so. I think it.
But
I don't think you jumped around.
and these kind of conversations, like when I do this with Meliti, we spend like 4 or 5, 6 hours digging into stuff, going off in different directions. But the thing I want to emphasize in all of this, even though we've been sort of spottily jumping around a little bit, is that when we keep it close to home and we allow just the ordinary reasoning and common sense about, I know how to manage my business, or I know how to manage my home, I know how to manage myself. Some of those principles have to be relevant. Some of the purposes I have in mind have to be relevant to defining purpose of government and purpose of everything. So maybe I can start just with what I know. And it's so much better than batting around words and ideas that are poorly defined. I've talked to people that if you mention the word socialism, they start foaming at the mouth and they're done.
Yeah.
And the opposite too. If you mention, I'm conservative, I surprise the heck out of people when I say that. They're done. Some of them are done. They stop, and it's like, what is this ability of words to trigger the closure of communication? And this is the opposite of what we have to do.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely.
So getting rid of all the foreign words and developing our own vocabulary to talk about everything, just out of our own sense of what I did today. And of course it's kind of hard to ask ourselves the questions that make that fruitful. But the part where I got you to think about, certain things that are necessary for the fulfillment of all purposes is an example of the kind of reasoning that, it starts to clarify. It's sort of like a preparatory thoughtfulness to get into the purpose of government. And so the more we can do that with our own personal lives and our ordinary capacities to reason about what we manage and govern for ourselves, helps us think about the governance of anything.
Yeah.
Let's see. What can we so we have this idea. So let's just switch to our society. Let's not do abstract. But we have a constitution that defines some purposes at the beginning. Its structure is the answer to those purposes. Is there anything about the Constitution that you want to bring up in terms of moving the conversation towards clarifying what the purpose of our government should be? You're welcome to bring up a sub-issue, and I can ask questions about that.
Well, I suppose that our Constitution is unique in the sense that it sort of seeks to restrain government. And that's rather unique, I suppose, when you look at other constitutions. It basically, they say that the government grants you these rights, whereas we have the opposite. They say that these rights come from God or whatever, government isn't supposed to interfere with your exercise, that you have these rights. So that's kind of interesting.
And in the idea of limiting the powers of government,
Yeah.
this suggests that the people are granted more power.
Yeah.
And so here's kind of another aspect of the purpose of government that's interesting to me about our democratic republic. If we live in a representative republic where our leaders are not our leaders, they're our representatives, that means we are the power, we are the government in essence.
Yeah.
If the Constitution's limiting the government's expressive ability, is it expecting us to behave in ways where we participate in the purpose of government? So how do we participate in the purpose of government? I think we touched on some of this last time with talk about justice. And even if you think about the fulfillment of purposes, if we do that with integrity, aren't we contributing to the health of our society? You can have businesses out there and people out there who are cheating on everything and lying about everything, and it's really hard to fulfill a purpose that's straightly defined. But if we do that well, are we not, as a just and fulfiller of purpose who does it with integrity, especially as we cooperate with fellow citizens? I mean, it seems like that's filling in the void where the government is limited. That's part of our responsibility to relate to one another with integrity. Would you?
Yeah, I would agree with that.
And so, what in your personal life can you think of? And you don't have to tell the details of it, but just take the principle or the structure, and say what have you done in your personal life where you've related to citizens that you can paint a picture of the purpose of government in terms of personal responsibility. So if the government's limited by the Constitution, then we're part of that government, so we have to fulfill the purpose. So can you think of anything in your personal life where, this seems like I stood up as a citizen and fulfilled a purpose of government by just my ordinary relationship with so-and-so or in whatever? I mean, some of that can be I run my business with integrity. I'm honest to my customers. Some of that can be I'm just and fair with other people. Can you think about your own experiences and illustrate in terms of you as a citizen fulfilling the purpose of government?
Well, I guess not interfering with other people, with it too well. I mean, like you said, there's kind of a fine line between sort of helping someone and not thwarting their aims, right? But just in sort of not interfering with someone in a way that they wouldn't appreciate, I guess, which is difficult to do.
Mm-hmm. And I imagine that if we think our society should be just, we think that we should be just. Would that be part of our responsibility to fulfill the purpose of government, is to be just for ourselves?
Yeah, absolutely.
So here's another dynamic. When you keep touching back to home, a lot of conversations would continue on with the purpose of government in terms of the structures that are established. Here's the person who gets paid to fulfill the purpose of government. But here, when you keep that home court thing where my personal experience is relevant, it becomes obvious that when an opportunity comes up, it's like, okay, if I'm responsible for the purpose of government, what do I do?
Yeah.
How do I stand up and help my society have whatever integrities and benefits are established as the purpose of governing ourselves?
But wouldn't you agree there's a difference between our society and our government? Like, Thomas Paine says, society in every state is a blessing, but government is a necessary evil, right? That implies that there's a difference between society and government.
Yes, you can define government in terms of the actual bureaucratic structures.
Yeah.
But if we look at it from a functional perspective, does it stay as separate as that? So, for example, in terms of law enforcement, if 100% of citizens refused 100% of the time to obey 100% of the laws, the law would be over, wouldn't it?
Sure.
I mean, are we not the number one enforcement of law when we willfully obey the law ourselves? So now, are we participating as citizens or in our capacity as enforcers of the law? The people are the government at a certain point. So I think from a functional perspective, it gets more blurry, but it's easy to define the bureaucratic structures of government in a cleanly separate way.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, is that really, should we define it in terms of its bureaucracy or in terms of its function? And if we define it in terms of its function, should we include ourselves, since the Constitution seems to, should we include ourselves
Yeah.
more than we usually think about?
Yeah, we should, but it's very difficult to separate the bureaucracy from the function because one of the things that really informs my thought about all of this is the book Political Parties by Robert Michaels, where he basically lays out the iron law of oligarchy. And he says that basically any complex system is destined to become oligarchical, meaning the bureaucracy can't really be separated from, the function, and that the bureaucracy eventually begins to take over what the original purpose was, and co-opt it.
Yeah, and it's interesting. It's just like an economy where eventually fewer and fewer actual business structures own more and more.
Yeah, exactly.
And so one of my questions is, you talked about one of the failures in government is the way they talk, and yet, are we not the ones that allow that?
Well, that's difficult to say.
And let me put it this way: would you accept your auto mechanic talking like a politician? Never talking about the actual details of your problem, blaming other people for everything that went wrong, never taking responsibility for anything, running away at the slightest chance they might have to actually discuss the details of your case. You'd do business with someone else, wouldn't you?
Yeah,
absolutely. And I mean, imagine how horrible it would be to find your doctors talking like politicians. Could you imagine a team of doctors that's going to operate on you, and they're calling each other names, and they're accusing each other of perverted things? You'd be like, I'm running for my life now, bye-bye. And yet we let politicians do that all the time. So how is it that we're not holding them accountable? And what's the key difference there? And so one of the things relative to purpose of government I wonder about is I think we mentioned some of this before, where the purpose of carpentry, for example, is to make things out of wood. Nobody disagrees with that.
Yeah.
That's a universal consensus. It's automatically defined. So isn't it easy to hold someone accountable to the knowledge of carpentry? But what is the purpose of politics? We had this kind of discussion before. There's not agreement on that. Yeah. And so I think that's our biggest weakness. It's so hard to hold people accountable when we don't even know what fundamentally we're doing with it. We haven't defined our end goals. We haven't defined the vision of the common good well enough, or what we think we're doing in terms of the end of the art of governance. In terms of purpose, it seems defining the purpose of government is a serious weakness in our society. We define all the arts, trades, and sciences to a T. I mean, it's precisely defined.
Yeah.
But it's like there's no specialist in politics. There's all this ambiguity in terms of the end, and that was that undefined dimension that we were talking about. Remember when I said, well, we can describe the things that are necessary. Yeah. To thrive, but what does that actual thriving look like? And that's where everyone has a different idea.
Yeah.
You ask people what the good life is, and a lot of people have very, very, very different ideas. Yeah. And so it's hard to coordinate our thoughts about purpose.
Yeah.
There. And
maybe that.
I'm sorry. I've
go on.
I've slipped out of the question asking. I should be doing all this by asking you questions.
Sure, go ahead.
Well, no, it's too late. I already blurted. But I interrupted you. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, do you think that the initial purpose of the, our republic was that to sort of allow people to thrive in the way that they best saw fit by sort of being as hands-off as possible? Would you agree that that's true, or not necessarily?
Well, I mean, back in that day, it was easy to live where there was no law enforcement, there was no government. People were spread out across the country, and there's certainly the idea of the individual standing up and doing for themselves, and that certainly is part of the thinking. It's definitely the function of the Constitution to limit government, not limit, the people. It's not about, defining the powers of the government, it's defining the limits of the government more. You got like in the 9th and 10th Amendment where it talks about, that which is not defined is given to the people and to the states. So, whatever federal powers are not, whatever rights are not defined in the Constitution are assumed to be reserved by the people. Whatever powers are not defined by the Constitution are assumed to be reserved by individuals or states, and not the federal government. So yeah, it's definitely about limitation.
Yeah.
So, one of the questions of purpose in the Constitution is, what does it mean to promote the general welfare?
Yeah.
These are things. What does it mean to secure the blessings of liberty? What are the blessings of liberty? It doesn't explicitly say those things.
No.
And so it's easy to say things like that, but then when you want to know, well, what does this really mean? We find that there's, a lot of undefined things. And, do we need to be more specific about that in order to clarify what it means to have a purpose of our government? Or has the Constitution defined enough? Is the structure of the branches, you got your legislative, your executive, your judicial, and the separation of powers and some defined rights that the people have, is that enough? Do we need just that minimum set and that's enough? And the purpose of government is clear enough from that, or does it actually leave that purpose of government undefined? Or are we, that undefined dimension we talked about earlier, is that still existing even though the Constitution has put some effort into defining the government? What does it actually mean what does it actually mean to thrive?
Yeah.
If the purpose of government is to help us thrive, promote the general welfare, what does that general welfare look like? And so there's no agreement on all this. There's always some basics in common. I mean, we know we'd rather not die, we'd rather not be sick, we'd rather not. But what does the positive side look like? And I don't think our purposes of government have ever gone there. It's always been about eliminating the negative obstacles, and then hope the positive manifests.
Yeah. Yeah.
One of the things, as I read Plato over the course of years and just thought about stuff, it always seemed clear to me that of all the questions about the virtues and about wisdom and knowledge, and that the most important seemed to be justice at times. And I found it very interesting that the list that you affirmed of things that were absolutely necessary, or maybe not all of them absolutely necessary, but pretty darn basic to be successful at fulfilling any purpose, the clearly defined reasons, vision of common good, etc., turned out to also be necessary for justice. Yeah. That what it takes to fulfill a purpose and what it takes to maintain justice are some of the same things.
Yeah.
And any thoughts about what that means?
You want to rephrase the question? I'm sorry.
That you're the things that are required to be successful at fulfilling purposes also seem to be necessary to maintain, necessary for justice. Any thoughts about that?
You mean like a common? You said so. What were they again? We said a common goal, working together for a common goal. What else did we say? The use of reason.
Well, of course, at this point, we're actually probably should formally shift to a potentially hours-long diversion into what is justice.
Yeah, well, we touched a bit on it last time.
Yeah, a little bit, but there's so much background and stuff, I sort of jumped around on that too. I'm not used to doing this on video. I do face-to-face a lot, but it's because it's interesting to me. If we can know things from our common sense about our daily experiences, that we could say, well, this is necessary for justice. Can we develop our reasoning to the point where we're better at deciding whether a proposed legislation is just, a proposed purpose of government is just or unjust? And this is something that I think takes practice.
Yeah.
This is not necessarily something that will bang out in a conversation, but it's something that takes time and practice thinking about. And this is where I would think, the people would benefit, if everybody was in the habit of just being a little more thoughtful about themselves.
Yeah.
I think the quality of political conversation would skyrocket, would increase significantly. Just the very idea that we don't have any patience anymore for not honestly talking about the details of a problem.
Yeah.
You would never do that in your personal life. If you had a goal to fulfill and a purpose to attend to, you want to do it well. You want to do it accurately. You're not going to up all the...
You assume too much integrity for everybody, but I don't know about that. Some people would rather not discuss the details of a problem. They'd rather blame someone or.
True. Of course, if we want to be successful optimally. And I guess there is the things about, there are people in our society who somehow manage to fulfill their purposes by defying the things we brought up.
Correct.
There are unjust people who, but yet, to the extent that they're successful, like I imagine, like a mafia boss has a team of people committing unjust things in society, committing crimes, but amongst themselves, they need justice. They need honesty and accuracy of communication. They need reliability of word and deed. They need respectful cooperation. Otherwise, nobody's able to do anything well. And I guess, some of the people who don't do these things, I can't imagine they're successful to the extent that they don't do them. You may get lucky for a while, but it can't turn out well over the long period. So, I guess the interesting thing that just occurred to me is that it seems that justice is more about function. What does it take to actually function with each other? We're exchanging energies all the time. It's almost as if justice is a pattern of energy exchange that optimizes function amongst humans. That's a potential for definition, but it would take some work to hammer out the details on that. And so maybe, what would you think about the idea of the purpose of government? Just optimizing our functioning.
Yeah.
Except we would have to define in detail what that means in the most general terms.
Yeah.
And
it sounds good as a first definition.
But
an unrefined definition.
Yeah, except you run into the point where general principles sound great generally, and then you run into specific circumstances that are like, what?
Yeah,
This
absolutely.
doesn't fit. This doesn't fit. But so it's.
What about the idea? Well,
I just want to make the point that the purpose of government and the purpose of individual living can't be separated, and I think we've even though we got a little jumpy back and forth with the dialogue, we did manage to illustrate that it's possible to think about your own life and have it have relevance.
Yeah, absolutely.
To the government, and to thinking about purpose of government. And I think one of the lapses of our politics is not the failure of the government, the bureaucracy. It's the failure of us, the people. We have let down our guard in terms of being thoughtful about our personal life, about living on the basis of principles beyond consumerism. And so what does it mean to encourage people to be better at that? In itself, maybe that's a purpose of government, but
I don't know if that's the purpose of government. Maybe that's the purpose of philosophy, is to encourage people to lead better lives.
Yeah, I had a friend of mine say that the purpose of government was to encourage talk about the public good.
That's so true.
And so, yeah, it's an interesting concept because ultimately that activity is absolutely necessary for people to thrive well.
Yeah.
I mean, I remember Immanuel Kant's great little essay, "What is Enlightenment?" where where he describes a society in which there was a continuous percolation of ideas, a continuous percolation of differences. It was a relentless drive to improvement. Nobody was repressing ideas. Nobody was getting in the way. And, well, in our society, it's more like Brave New World. Nobody has to get in the way. We've just given it up in favor of playing video games or something. You know, it's difficult to look at. But, you know, I like the idea that to the extent that all purposing involves speech, especially when it's in a group, that somehow the purpose of government will in some way be related to facilitating speech about something. It's like, you know, a doctor facilitates speech about bringing health to the body. The patients who go to doctors talk more about bringing health to their bodies. Carpenters facilitate speech about making things out of wood. What does the government facilitate speech about if it follows that pattern? So maybe there is something with the idea, but I don't know. Any ideas on what kind of speech would be most relevant to being facilitated as part of the purpose of government? You know, the purpose of a stonemason is to make things out of stone. Stonemasonry tends to facilitate speech about doing that. Is there a trade, art, or science metaphor that where we can think about that? It's hard to do that because again we run into the issue where we haven't defined the actual output of what it means to live well. The Constitution defines things in terms of eliminating negative obstacles and granting certain freedoms so that you're not suppressed. Does nothing to define what it means in the positive sense of living well. And yet that seems to be the heart of the purpose of government, of our government, is supposed to be about that. It just doesn't know how to define it in a positive sense. So that's a question for me that remains. What does that positive description look like?
Yeah, I'm not sure. That was, one of my motives for doing this, really.
Say it again.
I said I'm not sure, but that's one of my motives for sort of doing this project.
Yeah, it's I think one of the basic questions to think about is we have a defined structure for our government, and we're still not able to entirely say what the purpose is. There's not entirely agreement on that. But we do know that we're responsible somehow. I'd like to see more people thinking about the purpose of government in terms of their personal participation. I think it's an undefined dimension. We don't think of ourselves as fulfilling the purpose of government. We tend to externalize that. We're a nation of consumers. You pay other people to do the job. Let the professionals handle it. We have that attitude about politics for a long time. Yeah. But if the Constitution has anything to say about it, it seems that we're included in fulfilling that citizens in a democratic republic have a role to fulfill that can be defined in terms of fulfilling the purpose of government. Just by being just citizens. And there may be other things. So where are we lacking in fulfilling the purpose of government as a people? I think there might be a lot of power in responding to that kind of thinking. And that's and that's, again, here's a talk where thinking about political reform has nothing to do with thinking about the external bureaucratic structures. It has us to do with thinking about ourselves, taking a hard look at ourselves, and holding ourselves accountable in our personal living. Yeah,
no, I agree with that. And I'd like to think about that further, and maybe I can have you on again, later this year. We can touch on that. But maybe is this a good place to wrap up? Is there anything else you'd like to say?
Sure. Just overall, the most useful thing about the Socratic method is not that it's this elaborately detailed specific method, because much of Plato gets discarded as far as I'm concerned, but it's the focus. It's the focus about, just remember you don't really know what words mean. There's a lot of thinking to do, and be thoughtful about your character and your living and your choices and your ideas and your knowledge and your reasoning. So questioning myself just generally. that doesn't just help me in my personal scope, it helps me think about everything. And I think, we jumped around a bit, and I apologize for that, but we illustrate enough to show that there is some relevance in when you persist in thinking about your life, that it has relevance to your society and your government.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Oh, well, thank you, Max. This has been good. I don't think we jumped around very much. I thought it was very tight discussion, so.
Okay, well, it was a pleasure being here, and I look forward to seeing more videos on your channel.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much.
Okay,
All right,
take care.